My name is Charlotte Delacroix, and if you ask anyone who really knew me as a child, they'd say I was born with my mind already set on something bigger than Greenwich, Connecticut. I grew up in a sprawling colonial mansion just outside the city, surrounded by manicured lawns and ancient oaks that had stood long before my family ever laid eyes on America. The house itself, painted a dazzling white with its signature columns and slate roof, was a symbol of old money New England wealth with European sensibilities. My father, Jonathan Delacroix, was the very picture of a self-made American titan. He loved to tell the story of how he started with nothing but a borrowed $500 and a relentless drive, building Delacroix Holdings from the ground up in the hard world of steel, construction, and, eventually, technology. My mother, Genevieve, was French by birth, a touch of Parisian grace in the wilds of Connecticut, and our family floated between worlds, the businesslike pragmatism of New York and Boston, and the elegance of Europe. Summers were spent in the Hamptons, soaking up salt air and the company of Manhattan's elite, while every winter, if only for a week, we would find ourselves in London, swept along to the West End or high tea at Claridge's. We traveled, yes, but America always pulled us home. The Delacroix house was a fortress, safe, beautiful, and unyielding. From the earliest days, my father's attention was on my older brother, Ethan. He was the golden boy, the firstborn, handsome and wild. Even as children, he'd get away with murder, sneaking out to parties in Manhattan, returning home with the sun, red-eyed and smelling of expensive gin. My father would rage for a moment, but it always ended in forgiveness and another chance. Meanwhile, I was the quiet observer, the bookworm, forever at my mother's side, learning French and reading American biographies, secretly watching my father work. It's almost funny, looking back, that I ever expected to inherit the company. Ethan was the heir, even when he made it perfectly clear he had no real interest in the business. He spent more time in New York nightclubs and at Hampton's soirees than he ever did at the Delacroix boardroom table. My father and I had a relationship built on respect, but not always warmth. He was hard, demanding, and never easily pleased, but somewhere deep down I think I enjoyed the challenge. When I was accepted into Yale, it was the first time I ever saw my father show real pride. "That's my girl," he said to his friends at a dinner party in our dining room, the chandeliers sparkling, the fireplace roaring behind us. I majored in economics and political science, graduated at the top of my class, and without ceremony walked straight into the family business. Ethan sent a card from Ibiza. My father put me to work. My early years at Delacroix Holdings were brutal. I started in the mailroom, just like my father had, despite knowing the entire company better than most senior staff. He refused to give me special treatment, and I was determined not to ask for any. I took meetings at 7 a.m. and worked late into the night, learning every corner of the business, from steel contracts in Pittsburgh to tech startups in San Francisco. I traveled constantly from New York to Chicago to Los Angeles, then Miami, Dallas, and Seattle. I became fluent in airports, boardrooms, and backroom deals. The company was worth just over $800 million when I joined, but I was hungry. I saw potential where others saw risk. I negotiated deals with an iron will, expanded our holdings, and brought in a wave of younger, sharper talent who were willing to work as hard as I was. At 25, I closed a deal in Chicago that made the Wall Street Journal front page. At 29, I launched our first European acquisition, a tech firm in London that quadrupled in value within 2 years. My father's old-school friends would pull me aside at family parties and tell me they'd never seen a woman with my instincts. "You're a killer, Charlotte," they'd say, half admiring, half scared. I wore their skepticism like a badge of honor. Of course, none of it came without cost. Relationships slipped through my fingers. I watched friends get married, have children, and move to the suburbs, while I was closing deals in conference rooms with no windows and flying home to an empty penthouse in Manhattan. I sacrificed weekends, holidays, and sometimes even my health. The company became my family. Ethan, meanwhile, drifted further away. He came to board meetings when he was sober enough, nodding off during presentations or making jokes that only the oldest directors found funny. My father still held out hope that Ethan would turn a corner, but hope is a luxury for those who have time to wait. 15 years passed in a blur of hard work and hard decisions. By the time I was 37, I had helped grow Delacroix Holdings into a $21 billion empire. We were everywhere: steel and construction in the Midwest, high-rise tech in Silicon Valley, commercial real estate from Miami to Boston, and investments in renewable energy all over the American heartland. My office overlooked Central Park, the city at my feet, but the one view I wanted most, the corner office. The CEO chair remained out of reach. There were whispers in the corridors and the country clubs, speculation among the board about who would take over. Some believed it would finally be me. Others quietly hedged their bets on Ethan, despite his obvious flaws. My father remained enigmatic, never revealing his plans, never so much as hinting at his intentions. I kept believing that merit would win and that all my sacrifices and achievements would speak for themselves. I kept telling myself that in America, hard work meant everything. But deep down I sensed something else, a flicker of dread. A shadow that crossed my father's face whenever succession was mentioned. My mother would squeeze my hand at family dinners, her eyes full of worry, as if she knew something I didn't. Even our house in Greenwich, once so safe and solid, felt colder, as if waiting for a storm that everyone but me could see coming. And so I kept working, kept building, driven by pride and hope and the quiet terror of losing everything I'd spent my life creating. I never imagined that it could all be taken away, not by strangers or enemies, but by the very people I loved most. It was a crisp, icy December morning when everything I had ever worked for began to unravel. The city was wrapped in a cold fog, the kind that seeped into your bones and left you shivering no matter how many layers you wore. I remember looking out from the window of my Manhattan apartment, watching the gray light filter between the steel towers, and thinking that the world was holding its breath for something big. I felt a strange kind of anticipation humming under my skin, a hope I didn't dare put into words, not even to myself. That morning, I was called to the main boardroom of Delacroix Holdings' New York headquarters, a glass and steel monument perched above Fifth Avenue. Our building was the kind of place people photographed from below, craning their necks to capture its grandeur, the Delacroix name gleaming in silver above the doors. I walked through the revolving glass, past marble floors and Art Deco chandeliers, nodding at the security guards who knew me by name. I had walked these halls for more than a decade, feeling as if every inch belonged to me, and yet that day, each step felt heavy and uncertain. The boardroom itself was a cathedral of power, long polished mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the world, portraits of my father and his predecessors hanging in silent judgment. My father, Jonathan Delacroix, sat at the head of the table, his face expressionless, the skin around his eyes drawn tight. To his right, in an uncharacteristic show of punctuality, sat Ethan, my brother, looking disheveled even in his tailored suit, a lazy smirk twisting his mouth. The other board members, a mix of gray-haired titans and younger, hungrier faces, were already seated, eyes flicking between my father, Ethan, and me as I entered. I took my usual seat, back straight, hands folded over my notebook, and waited for the announcement I had prepared myself for, rehearsed for, and practically bled for. I believed with all my heart that this was my moment. The years I'd sacrificed, the deals I'd closed, the expansion I'd driven, all of it was supposed to lead here. CEO, my name is on the door. My vision steering the company into its next era. Instead, my father's words cut through the silence like a cold knife. Today, I am announcing the succession plan for Delacroix Holdings. His voice was flat, practiced, almost bored. He reached into a leather folder and pulled out a stack of papers. Sliding them toward Ethan, my brother's hand trembled, not with excitement, but with withdrawal, I suspected, and he grinned at me with a sneer so practiced it could have been rehearsed. "Your brother is the future of Delacroix Holdings," my father said, his tone leaving no room for argument. There was no emotion in his eyes, only a glint of resolve and perhaps a touch of shame that he couldn't meet my gaze for more than a heartbeat. The board members offered their polite applause, some nodding in Ethan's direction, others looking away, uncomfortable with the lie of it all. I sat frozen, the air knocked out of me as if I'd been punched. My hands began to shake, but I refused to let anyone see. I kept my jaw clenched, my chin lifted. Ethan, reeking faintly of last night's whiskey, yes, even at 10 in the morning, winked at me across the table. I wanted to scream, to throw something, but I did nothing. I simply sat there numb. As the meeting moved on, as if my life hadn't just been ripped apart in front of everyone I'd ever tried to impress. Afterward, my father called me into his office. The space was colder than usual, the blinds half drawn against the city. He didn't ask how I was feeling or offer any consolation. Instead, he launched into another script as if he'd planned every word. "There's something else, Charlotte," he said, clearing his throat. "Richard Davenport will be arriving from London next week. He's expressed interest in meeting you formally. His family's history in European finance goes back generations, and his capital could secure our future expansion into Europe. I want you to consider marrying him." It wasn't a question. It was a demand, wrapped in the language of business. My father had always treated me as an asset, but this arranging my marriage as if it were just another merger was a cruelty I hadn't anticipated. "You're 36. It's time you think about what's best for the family, not just yourself." I stared at him, my voice trembling with a mix of shock and anger. "I'm not marrying a stranger for money. I'm not for sale." My father's jaw tightened. "You will do as you're told, Charlotte. You owe this family everything." I left the office with my head spinning, rage and heartbreak warring inside me. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I ignored the congratulations from colleagues and the pitying glances from the few who understood what had truly happened. I went home that night and let myself grieve, not for the company but for the trust that had been shattered. The illusion that hard work and loyalty would be enough. The next morning, I arrived at my office early, determined to show at least a shred of dignity. That hope lasted only an hour before Ethan burst in, half drunk already, a bottle of Bordeaux clutched in his hand. He was wild-eyed, manic, and desperate for attention. "You think you're better than me, little sis?" he slurred, towering over my desk. I didn't answer, I simply stared, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. In a sudden, childish burst of rage, Ethan uncorked the bottle, and with a twisted grin, poured the deep red wine over my head. The liquid soaked my hair and my silk blouse, dripping down my face and onto the documents I had spent the night preparing. The sting of alcohol was nothing compared to the humiliation, the hot, public shame of it, the knowledge that everyone on my floor could hear and see. "You're out," Ethan spat. "You don't belong here. And don't come back." He tossed the empty bottle to the floor, shattering it across the marble, the shards catching the light like tiny knives. Security arrived within minutes, summoned by the noise. They didn't ask questions. They simply took me by the elbows and led me through the hallways, past coworkers whose eyes darted away. My shoes squelched on the polished marble as I walked, head held high, my pride the only thing they hadn't managed to strip away. As I stepped outside into the biting December air, I looked up, and there, in the corner office window, my father stood, watching. He didn't wave, he didn't call my name. He simply turned away and closed the blinds. And that was the day I lost everything, or so I thought. They thought I would disappear quietly, like a ghost, my name whispered only as a cautionary tale in polished boardrooms and cocktail parties. Ethan, in his arrogance, truly believed I was finished, ruined, outmaneuvered, and outcast by my own family. But the truth is, I am not a woman who accepts defeat. Not in America, where reinvention is practically a birthright, and especially not when the Delacroix name has been tattooed onto my soul. If I could not have my legacy the right way, then I would build it anew brick by brick, and, if necessary, from the ashes of everything I once loved. The days after my public humiliation passed in a blur of pain and confusion. I hid out in a cheap motel in Jersey City for a week, alternating between numbness and a cold, consuming rage. My phone buzzed with messages I ignored, most offering shallow sympathy, a few barely veiled with schadenfreude. A handful of true friends begged me to fight, but I knew better than to mount a frontal assault. The Delacroix machine was too powerful, the network too tightly woven, and besides, the scent of scandal clung to me like spilled wine. So I vanished. I withdrew every last cent from my personal savings, added the pitiful $5,000 severance check Ethan had so magnanimously arranged, and slipped north to Boston, a city far enough from New York to offer anonymity, but close enough to keep an eye on my enemies. I rented a tiny walk-up in Cambridge, a dingy, drafty place with peeling paint, warped floorboards, and a single battered desk by a dusty window. It was humbling and, in its way, liberating. No one here knew me. No one expected anything. My first act was to shed Charlotte Delacroix entirely. I became Charlotte Lake, a woman with no family ties, no Ivy League history, and no public profile. I bought thrift store jeans and oversized sweaters, traded my designer heels for worn-out sneakers, and practiced makeup techniques in the cracked bathroom mirror until I could transform my face into a stranger's. I even chopped my hair and dyed it a deep mahogany. The first time I saw my reflection, I didn't recognize myself, and that was the point. For weeks, I read everything I could about my former company. I followed the trades, the news, and every juicy bit of gossip circulating on financial blogs and Twitter. It became clear, almost immediately, that Ethan was running Delacroix Holdings into the ground. The headlines grew darker: missed earnings, failed acquisitions, scandals erupting over mismanaged funds. Ethan's reputation for recklessness and excess was no longer a family secret, it was front-page news. The business media pounced. Shareholders grew restless. I waited, watching the value I had built for half my life begin to erode. I needed to get inside, to be close to the rot. I applied for a job at Delacroix Holdings, under the name Charlotte Lake, aiming low. The analyst position was buried in a tech division Ethan barely understood, and the hiring manager, stretched thin and desperate for bodies, barely glanced at my resume. Within a week, I was sitting in a nondescript cubicle with a borrowed laptop and a plastic name badge. No one recognized me. The few who might have remembered the old Charlotte wouldn't have believed she was now fetching her coffee and eating lunch at her desk. From the inside, the decay was even worse. The company was a hollowed-out shell, bled dry by mismanagement and endless nepotism. Ethan filled key positions with his drinking buddies and mistresses. HR was a revolving door. I worked quietly, never drawing attention, while cataloging every single weakness. The under-the-table deals, the neglected compliance reports, the bribes sent to city inspectors in San Francisco and Miami. I began gathering evidence, slowly at first, then with the methodical patience of someone with nothing left to lose. I sabotaged deals when I could, sometimes as small as a typo in a contract that cost the company millions. Other times as large as leaking emails that exposed flagrant corruption. I tipped off journalists about a failed merger in Chicago, then sent a fat envelope to the SIG about the stock buybacks Ethan had ordered to artificially inflate our share price. I recruited other disillusioned employees, spinning a web of dissent throughout the company. The best people, the ones who truly cared, either left for better opportunities or joined me in undermining the toxic regime from within. Within a year, Delacroix Holdings was spiraling out of control. The press had a field day. From fortune to folly, the decline of a dynasty. Our stock, once trading at $145 a share, fell to single digits. Contracts evaporated, investors fled, and the company's lawyers spent more time managing crises than closing deals. Ethan, out of his depth, doubled down on bad decisions. My father's name, once golden, was now synonymous with scandal and shame. I admit there were nights I lay awake in my tiny apartment, shaking from adrenaline and guilt, wondering if I'd gone too far. But every memory of humiliation, every betrayal burned away the doubts. I pressed on. 80 months after I'd been thrown out, the company declared bankruptcy. The empire I had built, carefully, passionately, at the cost of every real relationship I'd ever had, was in ruins. There was a moment standing outside the courthouse on the morning of the bankruptcy auction when I felt the weight of what I'd done. My old name still carried enough power to get me a seat in the back of the auction room. I arrived in a tailored black dress, my hair cropped and dyed, eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. No one looked twice. No one recognized me. The auction itself was swift and merciless. Ethan didn't show. He was reportedly in rehab somewhere in Colorado, trying to buy sobriety with what little money he had left. My father was there, gray-faced and gaunt, surrounded by lawyers who barely spoke to him. When my turn came, I raised my hand and made my offer $14.2 million, less than a tenth of what the company's land alone was worth. There were a few weak bids, but no real competition. The family name was tarnished. No one wanted the mess. The gavel fell. Just like that, Delacroix Holdings, my family's legacy. My life's work was mine again, but on my terms and at my price. I walked out of the courthouse, the winter sun cold and bright on my face, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly powerful. I had remade myself, destroyed what needed to be destroyed, and now I stood ready to rebuild. Not for my father. Not for Ethan, but for myself, and for everyone who ever doubted what I was capable of. News travels fast in America's business world, and the downfall of the Delacroix dynasty was the story of the year. For days, headlines splashed across every business paper from New York to Los Angeles. Television anchors with dazzling white smiles dissected every detail. Once a $21 billion empire, now sold for pennies on the dollar. My phone was full of unread messages, the majority from journalists or former colleagues, all desperate for a quote or a confession, but I stayed silent. I let the world talk and watched from the shadows as the men who had once ruled my life lost everything. My father's fall from grace was particularly brutal. Jonathan Delacroix, the king of American industry, was suddenly a ghost, haunted and alone in the same Greenwich mansion where I'd once believed our family was unbreakable. The man who dominated boardrooms and barked orders at senators was reduced to a footnote in stories about corporate hubris. I saw the photos of him stooped, gray, hollow-eyed leaving the bankruptcy courthouse. I didn't rejoice in his suffering, but I didn't pity him either. He had made his choices. He'd picked Ethan, the son who brought nothing but shame to the family name, over the daughter who'd built the empire with her own two hands. Ethan, for his part, vanished. He didn't show his face at the bankruptcy auction, nor did he answer the calls of the lawyers or the pleas of old friends. Rumor had it he'd checked himself into a rehab clinic in Aspen, hiding from both the paparazzi and the creditors chasing his remaining fortune. I heard he sold off what was left of his trust fund to cover gambling debts and owed a small fortune in unpaid taxes. When I thought of him, there was only a hollow echo whatever love or loyalty I once felt for my brother had died the day. He poured wine over my head and spat me out onto the streets like trash. And so, on a gray, rain-soaked Monday morning, I returned to the place where my life had unraveled. My company now stood empty and silent, stripped of its grandeur. The Delacroix Holdings sign had already been pried from the marble wall. Soon the building would wear a new name, Lake Enterprises. My new legacy, and one nobody could ever take from me. The lobby was quiet, the echo of my heels sharp on the polished stone. I paused at the elevator, a wave of memories crashing over me, the first time I'd entered this building as a 22-year-old intern. The countless nights spent chasing impossible deadlines, and finally that humiliating walk of shame as security marched me out, wine-soaked and broken. I had returned now not as a victim, but as a victor rebuilt, relentless and completely unafraid. I took the elevator up to the executive floor. The offices were deserted, the once busy desks now bare. When I reached my father's office soon to be mine, I found him waiting. He looked older than I remembered, his once imposing frame shrunken inside a tailored suit that hung too loose on his shoulders. His eyes, always so steely, were watery and dull. He stood as I entered, a ghost of the man who had once loomed so large in my life. "Charlotte," he whispered as if my name itself were an accusation. "How could you do this?" I closed the door behind me and stood tall, refusing to shrink under his gaze. "You handed everything I'd built to a drunken fool," I said coldly. "You threw me out of my own company because I wouldn't let you sell me like a thoroughbred to the highest bidder. This isn't cruelty, father. This is justice." He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. I saw the flicker of regret, maybe even shame, but it was far too late for apologies. He pleaded, voice trembling, promising to make things right if I just gave him a chance. But all I felt was a cool, clean detachment. I had learned to be ruthless from the very best. There was no room left in my heart for forgiveness. Not after what he'd done. After he left, his footsteps heavy and defeated, I sat behind the desk, breathing in the silence. The view of Manhattan from the office window was the same as always, relentless, shimmering, alive with ambition. I watched the city for a long moment and promised myself that I would build something better than Delacroix Holdings ever was. Something worthy of the struggle it had taken to get here. That afternoon, I called an all-hands meeting, my first as CEO. the conference room filled with the remaining staff, nervous and exhausted. I stood at the head of the table and looked into each face, searching for the same hunger I once had. "This is the beginning of a new era," I announced, my voice steady and clear. "Lake Enterprises will be built on merit, not bloodlines. We will be diverse. We will be ethical. We will leave the toxic legacy of the Delacroix name behind us." I laid out my vision, sweeping changes in leadership, a commitment to diversity and transparency, and new programs to reward innovation and loyalty. There would be no more nepotism, no more favoritism, and no more secrets. I watched as the old guard shifted nervously in their seats, but I didn't care. They could stay if they were willing to change. If not, they would find the door. That same day, I held a press conference. Cameras flashed as I walked to the podium, the world watching. "Lake Enterprises is not just a new name," I told the journalists, "but a new promise. We will rebuild, we will thrive, and we will do it the right way." I could feel the tide turning. Investors who'd once run from the Delacroix name began to circle back, curious and eager for a second chance. The company's battered stock doubled within a week, then tripled as word of the new leadership spread. I never looked back. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of early morning, I would sit by my window and reflect on the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the humiliation, they had not destroyed me. They had forged me into something harder, stronger, and completely unbreakable. In the end, I did not just reclaim what had been stolen from me. I built something greater, on my terms, out of the ruins of the past. My father's pale face on the day he saw the Lake Enterprises banner rise above his old office was all the closure I needed. There was no anger left, only victory cold and clean. Because in America, revenge is not about hatred or bitterness. It's about winning, and I had won.